Hello everyone, and welcome to the fourth and final lecture in this temperate cropping systems component of the course, Introduction to Plant Agriculture. And we're finishing up this component with a lecture on that E component, environment. We're going to start off by distinguishing between climate and weather. So we can think about climate in terms of long-term averages of environmental variables, typically measured on a regional geographic scale. So Ontario, for example, is defined as having a humid climate because throughout the province we get 900, 1,000 millimeters of rainfall on average throughout the year. That is pretty evenly distributed. So Ontario has a humid climate. But that doesn't mean that on a given day, right, one area of Ontario might be really, really wet, lots of rainfall, and one area might be very, very dry. And that type of variability, which is day to day and local in terms of geographic scale, is weather. So climate has to do with long-term averages, while weather is more of that short-term, day-to-day fluctuations. Farmers design cropping systems based on the climate. So Ontario farmers generally don't wake up and say, hey, you know what, I think this is the year to grow bananas. I think this is the year to do it, okay? Because long-term climate just is not suitable to banana production. And Mary Ruth, Professor McDonald, is going to talk all about bananas in her tropical cropping systems lectures. Okay, so farmers are going to design cropping systems more or less around these long-term averages, but they still have to deal with that short-term, day-to-day, or season-to-season fluctuation. Is this going to be a relatively dry season, or a wet season, or a warm or a cold season? Because weather obviously fluctuates, and growing seasons fluctuate in a way that's hard to predict. So farmers manage weather with choices of G and M. So this slide you've seen before, and it just shows you some average climatic variables from different locations in Canada. And this is climate because it's average long-term temperatures, precipitation. I'm also showing you day length, which is the hours that the sun is in the sky on June 26th, the longest day of the year, the summer solstice. And just notice how changes in latitude, going from Guelph or Harrow, which is further south, to Peace River, which is further north, all the way to Trondheim in Norway. There's actually agriculture in this. This is a main agricultural region in Norway. Look at how day lengths change as you go further north in latitude. So the climate is made up of multiple environmental variables. We're not going to touch on every single one in this lecture, but I'm going to focus on the three most important ones, which is temperature, plant available water, and sunlight or photosynthetically active radiation. And I know you've touched on all of these three things earlier in Professor McAuliffe's lectures. For the purposes of cropping system design, it's not just the total amount of these variables that are experienced during the growing season, the total amount of rainfall or the total amount of photosynthetically active radiation. It's also its distribution over the growing season in relation to plant development that really matters. So, for example, when are maximum temperatures reached during the growing season, and at what stage is the crop normally at when those high temperatures are experienced? When does rain fall during the growing season on average, and what is its timing in relation to developmental events, and so on and so forth? When are days longest and we're getting the maximum amount of photosynthetically active radiation, because that will also vary throughout the growing season. So here's an example of what I mean by the distribution of temperature over the growing season. This is a table that shows you the lethal maximum temperature, the maximum temperature that wheat crop can experience before dying across different wheat growth stages. And as an example, a temperature of 25 degrees Celsius is not a problem if it's experienced during grain fill, but it's going to be a problem if it's experienced between vernalization to growth stage 30. This is a study that shows the effect of the same moisture, but experienced at different growth stages, the same plant available water or soil moisture. So this study done in Turkey irrigated either throughout the growing season from planting to maturity. They did not irrigate at all, or they irrigated only during certain growth stages, for example, from planting to V6, V6 to VT, etc. So if we were in a climate where rainfall only reliably fell during, a couple weeks of the season, let's say, we would want to ensure that the crop was planted, that corn reached a growth stage at which, it would have the maximum yield response to that rainfall that only fell for a couple of weeks. And in this case, what we can see is that we would want to ensure that that corn crop reached VT to R3 during, that timing when rainfall occurred, okay? Because that's when we get the biggest yield response, just looking at grain yield. We would want that rain to fall between VT and R3. We would not want it, for example, to fall between planting and V6. We don't get a very high yield response to that. And so we would try to ensure that our development matched that period of rainfall availability to maximize yield response. This same logic applies to solar radiation. In other words, we want to ensure that solar radiation is at its highest during key periods of crop development that are going to respond in terms of yield to that additional sunlight. So if you have climates where there's periods, weeks that are very cloudy, weeks that are very sunny, we're going to also have day length or photo period changes throughout the growing season. Days are going to get either longer or shorter during the growing season depending on latitude. You want to time those key developmental events to when we have sunny days that are also long. So this is data that just illustrates the point. This is from Australia. It's oats. Australian oats. And what these scientists did was they shaded this crop artificially, for a 2-week period. And they looked at, when was yield most reduced by a 2-week period of shading. And so as a farmer, an oat farmer in Australia, you would want to make sure that GS60 flowering, right, that had the biggest yield response or yield decline due to shading. You would want to make sure that flowering occurred during very sunny days, during periods that, would have little cloud cover, and also where days were longest to maximize PAR radiation. If you've been paying careful attention, you might have noticed that these research results seem to contradict themselves. That paper from Turkey showing that, it's rainfall from VT to R2, that's very, very important for crop yield. That's around pollination. And then this paper from Australia saying, well, you want the sunniest days, you want very sunny days occurring around flowering for maximum yield response to PAR. And so we're going to touch on this in a later lecture, but it's interesting. Around flowering, one study is saying you want a lot of rainfall, in this case irrigation. The other study is saying you want a lot of radiation. And when you think about it, days with a lot of rainfall aren't usually days with a lot of sun, and vice versa. So we're going to explore some of these trade-offs in later lectures.